The alarm hit before I even had my boots laced. My name is Elena Voss, and on this station everyone just calls me Rook, because I am the lowest-ranking officer allowed inside the observation deck of the Sentience Threshold trial. I was not supposed to be the one explaining humanity to a room full of panicking aliens today. But here we were, 3 minutes before the trial gates opened, and the lead evaluator, a tall, silver-skinned being named Director Thal, grabbed my arm so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. "Your people are laughing," Thal said, his voice shaking. "Why are your people laughing?" I looked past him, through the reinforced glass. Down in the holding bay, 5 human volunteers stood in a loose circle. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Owen Bradley, was midway through a joke about a chicken crossing a wormhole. Another, a woman named Priya Malhotra, was stretching her arms like she was about to go for a morning jog instead of walking into a simulation that had broken every other species that attempted it. "They do that," I said. "It is called nerves, or excitement. Sometimes both." Thal stared at me like I had grown a second head. Around us, the observation deck buzzed with delegates from 11 different worlds, all of them pressed against the glass, all of them silent except for the occasional nervous chitter or hum. Word had spread fast across the assembly network. After 3 centuries, a Deathworld species was finally being tested. Nobody in that room had ever seen one go through the trial. Most of them had only read reports, old records sealed under emergency classification, warnings passed down like ghost stories. The Sentience Threshold trial was not just an exam. It was the final gate every species had to pass before they were granted full membership rights across known space. Before the trial, a species could trade, could communicate, could even build outposts. But without passing the trial, no species could vote, no species could hold a seat on the Assembly Council, and no species could be trusted with certain technologies. It was built centuries ago, after a young species nearly wiped out 3 star systems, with a weapon they did not understand the consequences of using. Since then, every single species applying for full membership had to prove 3 things inside a sealed simulation chamber. They had to prove they could make hard choices under pressure. They had to prove they could survive extreme conditions without falling apart. And they had to prove that, when everything went wrong, when there was no way to win, they would not turn on each other. No species had ever passed all 3 sections cleanly. Some came close, most did not. I had read every file I could get access to before this assignment. A hive mind species called the Velinar failed the first section because their entire culture could not process the idea of one member acting alone to save the group. Their minds simply refused to accept an individual choice as valid, and the simulation flagged it as a critical failure within the first 60 seconds. A gentle water-dwelling species known as the Corvi failed the same section from the opposite direction. They were so devoted to avoiding harm that when given an impossible choice, they refused to choose at all, and every simulated person in that scenario was lost, while the Corvi representative simply floated in place, paralyzed. The second section, Survival Under Extreme Conditions, had an even worse record. Species after species had gone in confident and come out broken, if they came out at all. The environments were not designed to kill. They were designed to overwhelm, crushing gravity, burning air, endless darkness with things moving just outside the light. Some species handled the physical stress fine and shattered mentally within minutes. Others held together mentally and simply were not built to survive the physical conditions long enough to matter. The third section was the one that ended careers, ended alliances, and in a few recorded cases, ended lives. It was called the unwinnable scenario. Every species who reached that stage was placed in a situation with no correct answer, no way to save everyone, no path to victory. The trial did not measure whether they won. It measured what they became when they realized they could not win. History was full of species who turned on each other in that moment. Species who abandoned their own people to save themselves. Species who simply shut down entirely, unable to function once hope was gone. Every single species that had ever taken the full trial had failed at least one of these 3 sections. Some failed all 3. Humanity had never been allowed to take the trial before now. Earth had been flagged as a death world the moment the Assembly's scout ships got close enough to read our planet's history. Extreme weather, predators at every level of the food chain, diseases that had killed by the millions. A history soaked in conflict, yes, but also a history soaked in something the Assembly could not quite classify. something that made their scientists nervous every time they tried to write a risk assessment on us. They had kept us at arm's length for decades, trading with us, observing us, but never testing us. Until 3 weeks ago, when the Assembly Council finally voted, mostly out of curiosity, and partly out of pressure from human diplomats, who were tired of being treated like an unknown threat instead of a partner. So here we were. Down in the holding bay, Owen finished his joke, and the small group of humans actually laughed. Real laughter, the kind that comes from the chest. I watched 2 delegates from the Corvi species recoil slightly at the sound, as if it startled them. "This is disrespectful," said a reedy voice from behind me. I turned to see Ambassador Crix, a thin insect, like being with too many eyes for comfort, staring down at the holding bay, with something close to disgust. "They mock the trial before it begins." "They are not mocking it," I said, keeping my voice level. "This is how humans deal with pressure. Some people go quiet, some people talk too much, some people crack jokes. It does not mean they are not taking it seriously." Crix did not look convinced. Neither did most of the room. I understood why. From the outside, it must have looked absurd. Every other species that had ever stood in that holding bay before their trial had done so with visible fear. Some prayed, some meditated, some sat in complete silence, conserving energy for what was coming. The idea of walking toward the single hardest test in the galaxy while cracking jokes about chickens must have seemed, to them, like a complete failure to understand the stakes. But I had grown up around people like this. I had spent 2 years living among humans stationed on frontier outposts before I got assigned to this observation post, and I had learned something that the Assembly's files never quite captured. Humans use humor the way other species use armor. It does not mean the danger is not real. It means we have decided, somewhere deep in our history, that if we are going to face something terrifying, we would rather face it while smiling than face it while breaking. The 5 volunteers were not chosen at random. I had reviewed their files myself. Owen Bradley had spent 6 years as an emergency rescue diver, pulling people out of collapsed structures and flooded buildings. Priya Malhotra had been a field medic in 3 different conflict zones before she turned 30. A quiet, sharp-eyed man named Diego Ferreira had survived 2 shipwrecks and a mountain expedition that killed 4 of his 6 companions. A woman named Ingrid Solberg had spent a decade studying extreme environments, from the bottom of frozen oceans to the edges of active volcanoes. And the last volunteer, a younger man named Malik Osei, had grown up in a region hit by hurricanes almost every year of his childhood and had personally helped rebuild his hometown 3 separate times. These were not soldiers sent to prove a point. These were people who had already lived through versions of the trial long before they ever stepped inside a simulation chamber. The intercom crackled to life. A calm, synthetic voice announced that the trial gates would open in 90 seconds. Down in the holding bay, the laughter faded, but not the ease. Owen rolled his shoulders. Priya checked the strap on her wrist monitor out of habit, even though she knew it would not matter once the simulation began. Diego closed his eyes for a moment, took one slow breath, and opened them again, looking completely calm. Ingrid was already staring at the sealed door, with the focused expression of someone studying a puzzle rather than fearing a threat. Malik simply reached over and gave Owen's shoulder a light tap, and Owen tapped him back, a small silent gesture that needed no translation. Behind me, Director Thal was speaking quietly into a communicator, relaying updates to someone higher up the chain. I caught fragments of his words. Unprecedented calm. Possible malfunction in emotional response scanners. Recommend immediate review of baseline data. Their scanners are not malfunctioning, I said, loud enough for him to hear. That is just how they look before something hard. He lowered the communicator and studied me for a long moment. You sound almost proud of them. I thought about that for a second before I answered. I suppose I am. The countdown reached 0. With a deep mechanical groan, the massive doors to the trial chamber began sliding open, revealing a corridor of shifting light that led into the simulation itself. This was the last calm moment before everything the Assembly thought they knew about survival, about morality, about breaking points, was about to be tested against a species they had spent decades trying to understand from a careful, cautious distance. Owen glanced back once, toward the observation deck. He could not have seen us through the one-way glass. but somehow, it felt like he was looking directly at me. He gave a small, easy smile, the kind of smile people give right before doing something difficult, not because the fear is gone, but because they have made peace with walking through it anyway. Then the 5 of them stepped forward into the light, and the doors closed behind them with a sound like a held breath finally being released. The observation deck fell completely silent. Every delegate, every ambassador, every nervous set of eyes fixed on the massive display screens that would soon show us exactly what was happening inside that sealed chamber. Nobody in that room, myself included, had any idea what we were about to witness. All I knew was that in a few moments, the trial would begin measuring the first of its 3 impossible sections, and for the first time in 300 years, a Deathworld species was about to face it. The screens flickered once, then settled into a clear image of the simulation's opening scenario. Somewhere in that room, an alien voice whispered something I could not quite translate, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the sound of dread. I did not feel dread. I felt something closer to anticipation, the same feeling I used to get watching Owen and his rescue team prepare to go into a collapsed building, knowing they were about to do something dangerous, and knowing, somehow, that they would find a way through it anyway. The trial had begun, and nothing in the Assembly's 300 years of history had prepared them for what came next. The first screen flickered to life with a scenario that had been used, in one form or another, for the last 2 centuries. It was called the bridge scenario, and I had read enough transcripts of past attempts to know exactly how it worked, even before the simulation rendered its first image. Inside the chamber, Owen, Priya, Diego, Ingrid, and Malik found themselves standing on a narrow platform overlooking a deep ravine. A crumbling rope bridge stretched across the gap, and on the far side, a group of simulated figures, 12 of them, were trapped on a ledge that was slowly breaking apart beneath their feet. The bridge could hold the weight of a few people crossing quickly, but the simulation had already made clear, through a calm narrating voice that echoed across the chamber, that the bridge would collapse within 4 minutes, regardless of what anyone did. On the near side, closer to the 5 volunteers, a single simulated figure lay pinned beneath a fallen support beam, unable to move, calling out for help. The math was cruel and deliberately impossible. If the volunteers spent time freeing the pinned figure, they would not have enough time to cross the bridge and lead the 12 trapped people to safety before it collapsed. If they crossed the bridge immediately, they could likely save most or all of the 12, but the pinned figure would be left behind when the platform beneath it eventually gave way. This was the exact test that had broken the Velinar hive mind. Their species could not conceive of sacrificing one individual through a choice made by other individuals, because their entire culture functioned as a single collective consciousness. When faced with this scenario, their representative had frozen completely, unable to process a decision that required weighing one life against 12, because in their culture, no single node of the collective was ever allowed to make that kind of call alone. The simulation had ended in failure within the first 60 seconds, flagged as a total inability to exercise individual moral judgment. It was also the same test that had broken the Corvi. Their representative, faced with the same impossible math, had refused to choose either path, standing frozen at the center of the platform while precious seconds ticked away, until the bridge collapsed and every single simulated figure was lost, both the 12 on the far ledge and the one trapped beneath the beam. The Corvi's devotion to avoiding harm through action had, ironically, caused far greater harm through inaction. I held my breath as the timer appeared on the display, glowing red at the top corner of the screen. Around me, the observation deck had gone utterly silent, delegates leaning forward, some literally on the edges of their seats, waiting to see how the Deathworlders would respond to the same impossible choice that had ended so many other trials. Owen was the first to move, but not toward the bridge and not toward the pinned figure. He turned to the others and spoke fast, his voice clear even through the audio pickup. "Diego, Ingrid, get that beam off him. Priya, Malik with me. We're going across." It happened so quickly that for a moment, I thought I had misheard the translation. They were not choosing one over the other. They were splitting up. Ingrid and Diego moved to the pinned figure immediately, working together to find leverage points on the fallen beam. Ingrid called out measurements, calculating angles with the same calm focus she must have used studying frozen oceans and volcanic vents. Diego braced his shoulder against the beam, and pushed while she worked a length of loose cable free from the wreckage, wrapping it around the beam as a makeshift pulley system. At the same time, Owen, Priya, and Malik sprinted across the crumbling bridge. I watched the wood groan and splinter under their combined weight, watched Priya nearly lose her footing on a rotted plank, watched Malik grab her arm without breaking stride and pull her forward. They reached the far side in under 90 seconds, nearly a full minute faster than the simulation's internal benchmark suggested should have been physically possible for 3 people crossing that particular structure. On the far ledge, the 12 simulated figures were already terrified, and I watched Priya immediately shift into what I can only describe as emergency triage mode. She began sorting them by mobility, directing the ones who could move quickly to start crossing first, while Owen and Malik worked to stabilize a section of the ledge that was crumbling faster than the rest. It was not glamorous. It was not dramatic, in the way the assembly's old training footage of heroic rescues always seemed to be. It was fast, practical, almost mechanical in its efficiency, the kind of coordinated response you only get from people who have trained for exactly this kind of chaos. Back on the near side, Ingrid's pulley system worked. The beam lifted just enough for Diego to pull the pinned figure free. The moment the figure was clear, Diego did something the simulation clearly had not accounted for. He picked the figure up and started running toward the bridge himself, shouting something to Ingrid that the audio pickup translated as, "We can still make the crossing, move." I glanced at the timer. 2 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. The bridge was already visibly failing, planks dropping away into the ravine below. But Diego and Ingrid reached it anyway, moving fast, and began crossing just as the last of the 12 figures from the far ledge were being helped down a stabilized section that Owen and Malik had rigged using rope from the ledge itself. For a moment, both groups were on the bridge at the same time, moving in opposite directions, and I honestly thought I was about to watch the entire structure give way with people from both sides still on it. It held. Barely. Diego, Ingrid, and the previously pinned figure made it across just as Owen, Priya, and Malik finished helping the last of the 12 figures onto solid ground on the near side. The bridge collapsed 4 seconds after the last person cleared it, the countdown timer reaching 0 at almost the exact same instant. The simulation's ambient lighting shifted, the way I understood it always did when a scenario resolved. On the display screens, a status line appeared, one I had never actually seen appear during any of the historical trial footage I had studied. Full success. 0 losses. Scenario parameters exceeded. The observation deck erupted into a confusion of overlapping voices, translated fragments colliding in the air around me. I heard Director Thal say something to another evaluator that translated roughly as, "That outcome was not supposed to be possible." I heard Ambassador Crix's reedy voice rise sharply, demanding to know if the simulation had malfunctioned. It had not malfunctioned. I understood, watching the replay data scroll across a secondary screen, exactly what had happened. The scenario had been built around a binary choice, because every species who had ever faced it, across 3 centuries of trials, had approached it as a binary choice. Save the 12, or save the 1. The simulation's underlying logic had never needed to account for a third option, because no species had ever attempted one, let alone succeeded at it. Humans had simply refused to accept that the only options available were the ones presented to them. Owen had made that decision in the span of maybe 2 seconds, splitting his team based on an instant assessment of who could accomplish what, trusting each pair to handle their piece of an impossible puzzle without him standing over their shoulder giving instructions the entire time. I found myself smiling, and I quickly wiped the expression from my face when I noticed Director Thal watching me. "Explain this," he said, his voice tight. "Explain how they knew this was possible when nothing in 300 years of trial data suggested it was." I thought about how to answer that honestly. "They didn't know it was possible," I said. "I don't think they thought about whether it was possible at all. I think they just looked at the problem and asked what needed to happen, and then they went and did all of it at once, because trying felt better than choosing." Crix's many eyes blinked in rapid succession, a gesture I had learned usually indicated distress. "That is reckless. They gambled everyone's survival on an unproven strategy under time pressure." "Maybe," I said, "but it worked." Thal did not respond to that. He turned back to the display screens, where the simulation was already resetting, preparing the environment for the second section of the trial. I watched his expression carefully, the subtle shift in the muscles around his eyes that I had come to recognize, over months of working alongside members of his species, as something close to genuine unease. Down in the simulation chamber, the 5 volunteers stood together on solid ground where the ravine had been, breathing hard, some of them with hands on their knees. I watched Priya reach over and check Diego's shoulder, the one he had used to brace the fallen beam, running quick fingers along it in the automatic gesture of someone who had spent years checking for injuries after every crisis. Diego waved her off, said something that made Malik laugh, a short, exhausted sound, more relief than humor. They did not celebrate. There was no cheering, no triumphant display for cameras that were not even visible to them inside the simulation. They simply regrouped, checked on each other, and turned to face whatever came next, because they all understood, without needing to say it out loud, that this had only been the first of 3 sections, and the hardest parts were still ahead. On the observation deck, the mood had shifted from anxious anticipation to something closer to stunned disbelief. Several delegates had gone quiet entirely, watching the replay footage loop on smaller secondary screens, studying the movements of the 5 humans with an intensity that suggested they were trying to understand something that did not fit into any framework their species had ever built. I caught a fragment of conversation between 2 delegates from a species I did not immediately recognize, their translated words drifting toward me across the deck. They split their forces without hesitation. They trusted each other completely, with no communication beyond a few words. How is that possible without a shared consciousness? I wanted to explain it to them, the way I understood it after 2 years living among people like Owen and Priya and the others. It was not a shared consciousness. It was something else. Something built over generations of living on a world that demanded constant cooperation, just to survive at all. Trust, in humans, was not something that required a hive mind to function. It was built through practice, through history, through the simple fact that when the world kept trying to kill you, the only way through it was to rely on the people standing next to you, and to earn the kind of reliability that let others do the same in return. I did not say any of that out loud. Instead, I watched the display screens as the simulation environment finished resetting, the calm ravine and broken bridge fading away, replaced by something colder, darker, and far more physically punishing than anything the 5 volunteers had faced so far. The second section was about to begin, and based on everything I had read about the trial's history, this was the part where species did not just fail. This was the part where species broke. The chamber's lighting dropped to almost nothing, replaced by a dim red glow that painted the walls in shifting shadows. I had seen the historical footage for this section before, and even knowing what to expect, the sight of it always made something tighten in my chest. This was the section built to overwhelm, not through impossible moral choices, but through raw physical and psychological pressure, layered on top of itself again and again, until something inside a candidate finally gave out. The environment rendered around the 5 volunteers piece by piece. Gravity increased first, a slow, crushing weight that the simulation's internal readout measured at nearly triple standard. The air thinned and thickened with toxic compounds in irregular cycles, forcing anyone inside to rely on emergency filtration masks that had been issued before they entered. Jagged rock formations rose out of a cracked, uneven landscape, and somewhere in the distance, low, guttural sounds echoed. The kind of sounds that promised something large and hostile was moving through the darkness, waiting. I had read the file on this exact configuration. It was modeled loosely after conditions found on some of the harshest known worlds in assembly space, combined into a single environment, specifically because no naturally occurring planet had ever forced a species to adapt to all of these pressures simultaneously. It was meant to be unfair. That was the point. Survival trials that could be solved through preparation alone did not measure resilience, they measured planning. This section measured what happened when preparation ran out, and a species had to improvise against conditions their bodies were never built to handle. The historical failure rate here was worse than the first section. A tall, elegant species called the Orinth had entered this same environment 200 years ago. 4 representatives sent in together, and within the first 10 minutes, the crushing gravity had caused 2 of them to collapse from cardiac strain the simulation had to abort before actual harm occurred. The remaining 2 had frozen in place, paralyzed by the disorienting toxic air cycles, unable to trust their own senses enough to move forward. and the trial had ended in total failure less than 15 minutes after it began. A more recent attempt, only 60 years ago, involved a resilient rock-dwelling species called the Ferukai, physically strong enough to withstand the gravity without much trouble. Their bodies handled the crushing pressure with ease, but the psychological toll of the darkness, the constant threat sounds, and the disorienting toxic cycles had broken something in their group cohesion within the first hour. Reports describe the surviving evaluators watching in real time as trust between the 4 Ferukai representatives eroded, arguments breaking out over which direction to move, until eventually 2 of them abandoned the other 2 entirely, choosing to attempt the environment alone, rather than continue working as a team. The trial had ended not because the environment killed them, but because they turned on each other before it had the chance to. I watched the 5 volunteers move through the opening minutes of this new hell with something close to disbelief. Owen adjusted his mask with one hand, checking the seal, then immediately began scanning the terrain with the sharp, practiced eyes of someone who had spent years assessing collapsed and unstable structures for the safest path forward. "Watch your footing on the loose rock," he called out, his voice slightly muffled through the filtration mask. "It shifts under weight." Ingrid was already crouched beside a jagged outcropping, running her fingers along a mineral vein in the rock face, and I realized, with something close to amazement, that she was studying the terrain itself, treating this deadly, hostile environment as a subject of genuine curiosity, rather than a threat to simply survive. "This composition is fascinating," she said, loud enough for the audio pickup to catch clearly. "If this were real, the mineral density here would suggest volcanic activity nearby. Might explain the air toxicity." Diego was testing the ground ahead of them with slow, deliberate steps, the same careful pace I imagined he must have used on the mountain expedition that had cost him 2 companions years earlier. Priya kept close to Malik, both of them monitoring each other's breathing through the masks, watching for the first signs of distress that the crushing gravity or thin air might cause. They moved as a unit, not through any explicit coordination system, but through what looked to me like instinct built from experience, the kind of unspoken rhythm that comes from people who trust each other's judgment without needing to constantly check in. When Owen signaled a direction change with a simple hand gesture, the others adjusted without question. When Ingrid paused to examine something, the group slowed naturally around her without anyone needing to call out an instruction. The gravity took its toll gradually. I watched their movements grow heavier over the following 20 minutes, shoulders dropping slightly, steps becoming more deliberate, as their bodies fought against the crushing weight. Priya's breathing grew audibly labored through the audio pickup, and at one point she stumbled, catching herself against a rock formation. Malik was beside her instantly, one hand steadying her shoulder. "I'm fine," she said, straightening up, "just adjusting." "Take 30 seconds, Owen said, and to my surprise, the entire group stopped without argument, giving her the moment she needed to catch her breath, before continuing forward. There was no urgency in his voice, suggesting she had failed some standard, no impatience at the delay. It was simply a practical adjustment, the kind of thing I imagined rescue teams did constantly in the field, understanding that pushing someone past their limit too early only created bigger problems later. The guttural sounds in the distance grew louder as they pressed deeper into the environment, and I felt my own pulse quicken watching the display, even knowing that nothing inside that simulation could actually reach through the screen and touch me. The simulation's threat generation system was designed to create genuine tension, rendering creatures that existed only within the pocket dimension, but were built to feel completely real to anyone inside it. The first creature appeared roughly 40 minutes into the section, emerging from a rocky crevice ahead of the group. It was large, easily twice the height of any of the 5 humans, covered in dark-plated scales, with too many limbs, and a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. I had watched footage of similar simulated creatures from other species trials, watched candidates freeze completely, watched others turn and run in directions that led them straight into worse danger. Owen held up a fist, the universal signal for stop, and the group froze in place instantly. For a long moment, nobody moved. The creature turned its head slowly, scanning the darkness, clearly searching for something. "It's hunting by sound," Ingrid whispered, her voice barely audible through the audio pickup. "Watch how it reacts to the loose rock falling behind it." "It's not looking at us, it's listening." Diego nodded slowly, understanding immediately. Without a word, he crouched down and picked up a small loose stone, weighing it in his palm, before tossing it in a wide arc away from the group, letting it clatter against rock formations off to their left. The creature's head snapped toward the sound instantly, and it began moving away from them, drawn by the noise. They waited until it had moved fully out of sight before continuing forward, moving low and quiet, communicating through small gestures rather than spoken words. I found myself leaning forward in my seat, watching every step with the kind of focus I usually reserved for emergencies back on the frontier outposts. The second creature encounter, nearly an hour later, did not go as smoothly. This one emerged suddenly from behind a rock formation, close enough that there was no time for a quiet distraction. It lunged toward Malik, who was slightly separated from the rest of the group after helping Priya over an unstable section of terrain. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but it felt, watching it, like it stretched out much longer. Owen moved first, closing the distance faster than I would have believed possible given the crushing gravity, placing himself between the creature and Malik. Diego grabbed a length of rope from his gear and, in a motion that seemed almost too fast to track, looped it around a jagged rock spur near the creature's path, creating an obstacle that caused it to stumble mid-lunge. Priya, despite her labored breathing from earlier, was already moving to pull Malik backward out of range. The creature recovered from its stumble and turned its attention to Owen, who stood his ground, using a length of broken rock as an improvised weapon, not to attack, but to redirect the creature's momentum away from himself and toward an open path leading deeper into the rock formations. It was not a fight. It was a controlled retreat, carefully managed so that no one on the team ended up in the creature's direct path. The creature eventually lost interest, moving off toward the sounds of its earlier prey trail, and the group regrouped, breathing hard, checking each other over for injuries. There were none. Owen had a torn sleeve, where the creature's claws had caught fabric but never skin. Malik's face was pale, clearly shaken, but he managed a small, tight laugh. "Well," he said, still catching his breath, "that was close enough for me." "You're all right," Priya said, checking his shoulder anyway, her medical training clearly overriding any instinct to simply take his word for it. "Pulse is fast but steady. You're fine." I noticed something in that moment that struck me more than the physical skill they had just displayed. Nobody blamed Malik for being separated from the group when the creature attacked. Nobody criticized his positioning or suggested he had made a mistake. The focus, immediately and without hesitation, was on making sure he was physically all right, and then on continuing forward together. I glanced at Director Thal, who was watching the screen with an expression I could not quite read. "This section," I said quietly, "it's designed to break group cohesion under stress, isn't it? That's what happened with the Farakai." He nodded slowly. "Fear and exhaustion tend to expose the fractures already present within a group. Species who maintain rigid hierarchies often see those hierarchies collapse under this kind of pressure, with blame replacing cooperation. It has ended more trials than any other section." "They're not doing that," I said. "No," he admitted, "they are not." The environmental pressure continued to mount over the following 2 hours of simulated time, the gravity never easing, the toxic air cycles growing slightly more frequent, the darkness pressing in from every direction. I watched exhaustion creep visibly into all 5 volunteers. Ingrid's earlier scientific curiosity faded into quiet, focused determination. Diego's careful, measured steps grew slower, more labored. Priya's breathing never fully evened out again after the earlier strain, and I could see her masking discomfort behind a calm expression each time Owen or Malik checked on her. And then, almost 2.5 hours into the section, they encountered something the simulation had clearly not intended as a standard threat. A smaller creature, injured, trapped beneath a collapsed section of rock formation, similar in build to the larger predators they had avoided earlier, but clearly no threat in its current state. It made a low, pained sound as they approached, thrashing weakly against the rock pinning one of its limbs. I expected them to walk past it. Every ounce of trial logic I understood suggested that stopping for an injured simulated creature, one that existed purely as an environmental hazard within a hostile survival test, served no purpose and only risked further exposure to the toxic air cycles and the other predators still moving somewhere in the darkness. Ingrid crouched beside it anyway, her attention completely captured by the creature's labored breathing. "We don't have time for this," Diego said quietly, not unkindly, simply stating the practical reality of their situation. The section timer was still running, and their exhaustion was mounting with every passing minute. "I know," Ingrid said. She did not move to help it immediately. She simply looked at it a moment longer before glancing back at the group. "It's not going to hurt us, it's just stuck." Owen studied the scene for a long moment, then made a decision that I still, even now, find difficult to fully explain to anyone who has not spent real time understanding how humans think. 2 minutes, he said. "Diego, help her shift the rock. The rest of us watch the perimeter." It took closer to 90 seconds. Diego and Ingrid worked together to lever the rock formation, just enough for the creature to pull its injured limb free. The moment it was loose, it scrambled away into the darkness, moving in an uneven, limping gait, disappearing from view within seconds. Nobody commented on it afterward. They simply continued forward, the group falling back into its steady, careful rhythm, as though pausing to free a simulated predator from a pile of rubble in the middle of a life-threatening survival trial was a completely unremarkable thing to do. I looked over at Director Thal, and for the first time since the trial had begun, I saw something on his face that was not confusion or unease. It looked, unmistakably, like something closer to wonder. "Why would they risk exposure for that?" he asked quietly, more to himself than to me. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't think they saw it as a risk worth calculating," I said. "I think Priya said it best earlier, back during a training exercise I watched once. She said something looked like it was having a worse day than she was." Thal did not respond to that. He simply turned back to the screen, watching as the 5 volunteers pressed onward, through the crushing gravity, and the toxic air, and the darkness full of things that wanted to hurt them, moving not like people trying to survive an ordeal, but like people who had simply decided, somewhere deep in their shared history, that the only way through the worst conditions the universe could offer was to keep looking out for each other, and for anything else caught in the same storm, until the storm finally broke. The section timer continued its slow countdown, marking the hours remaining before this environment would end, and the third and final section, the one no species in 3 centuries had ever truly passed, would begin. A hand landed on my shoulder before the environment had even fully faded from the display screens. I turned to find Director Thal standing close, closer than protocol usually allowed between an evaluator and a junior liaison officer, his expression tight with something that looked almost like desperation. "Walk with me," he said, and it was not a request. He led me away from the main observation deck, through a side corridor lined with quiet status displays, into a smaller briefing room where 3 other evaluators were already waiting. I recognized 2 of them from earlier introductions, a broad-shouldered evaluator from a species called the Renthic, and a small, quick-moving representative from a species I still had trouble pronouncing correctly. Ambassador Crix was there as well, standing near the far wall, with all of his eyes fixed on me the moment I walked in. "Sit," Thal said, gesturing to an empty chair. I sat, though I noticed nobody else in the room did. They stood in a loose half-circle around me, and for a moment, I felt less like a colleague being consulted, and more like a witness being questioned. 2 sections completed, Thal said, pulling up a display that showed a summary of the trial so far. 0 losses in the first scenario, complete environmental traversal in the second, with injury rates lower than any recorded attempt in 3 centuries of data. Group cohesion metrics remained stable throughout, even during moments of extreme physical and psychological strain. "That's good news, isn't it?" I said carefully. "It is unprecedented," Crix said, his reedy voice sharper than usual. "No species has ever completed the first 2 sections without at least 1 critical failure flag. Your people have completed both, with what our systems are calling optimal execution." "I don't understand the problem," I said, though I suspected I already did. Thal exchanged a glance with the other evaluators, before speaking again. "The problem, Officer Voss, is that we do not understand why. Every species we have ever tested approaches these trials with appropriate fear. Fear that shapes decision-making, fear that creates caution, fear that, frankly, we use as a baseline to measure psychological stability. Your people showed almost none of it. They made jokes before entering the chamber. They stopped to help an injured creature that posed no benefit to their survival. They split their forces on an unproven strategy, within seconds of facing an impossible choice. This is not the behavior of a species under appropriate stress." "With respect," I said, choosing my words carefully, I think you're mistaking the absence of visible panic for the absence of stress. They are stressed. I watched Priya's hands shake slightly when she checked Malik's shoulder after the creature encounter. I watched Diego take an extra second before answering Owen during the bridge scenario, weighing the risk in his head, even though he moved fast. The stress is there. It just doesn't look the way your data expects it to look. Then explain it to us, Thal said, and for the first time, his voice softened into something closer to genuine curiosity than clinical concern. Please, we pulled you into this room because you have spent real time among them. Our files, our historical data, none of it prepares us for what we are watching. Why are your people smiling in the face of something that has broken every other species we have ever tested? I sat with the question for a long moment, trying to find an answer that would actually mean something to beings who had never lived a single day on a world like mine. Earth is not a kind planet, I said finally. I don't mean that as an insult to my own home. I mean it as simple fact. Long before humans built cities or governments or any of the things your species associate with civilization, the planet itself was already trying to kill us in a dozen different ways at once. Extreme weather that could wipe out a settlement in a single night. Diseases that spread faster than we understood how to stop them. Predators built specifically to hunt creatures like us. Food that could poison you if you did not know exactly how to prepare it. Seasons that could freeze you or starve you if you were not prepared months in advance. I paused, gathering my thoughts. Nobody in the room interrupted. For most of our history, humans did not get to choose whether to face danger. Danger was simply the baseline condition of being alive. And a species that spends that long living under constant threat either learns to find some way to endure it, or it does not survive long enough to become a species that builds spacecraft and gets invited to trials like this one. We found ways to endure it. Humor was one of those ways. Long before humans understood psychology or resilience as concepts we could study, we already understood, on some instinctive level, that facing something terrifying with a small joke, a shared laugh, a moment of lightness, made that thing easier to face than facing it in complete silence and dread. That seems like a dangerous coping mechanism, Crick said. Laughter in the face of genuine danger suggests a failure to properly assess risk. I understand why it looks that way, I said, but I've watched it happen too many times to believe that's what's actually going on. I spent 2 years on a frontier outpost before this assignment. I watched emergency response teams, people like Owen, prepare to go into situations that could easily kill them, and I watched them joke with each other in the final minutes before deployment, every single time. It was not because they did not understand the danger. It was because understanding the danger too deeply, letting it sit unchallenged in your mind, right before you have to act, makes people freeze. The joke is not denial. The joke is armor. It is a way of saying, I see exactly how bad this is, and I am choosing to walk into it anyway, on my own terms, without letting the fear decide how I show up. The room was quiet for a moment. The smaller, quick-moving evaluator spoke for the first time since I had entered. And the creature, the one they stopped to free from the rubble. What was the purpose of that action? It provided no survival advantage. It introduced unnecessary risk during an already dangerous section. I thought about how to explain that one, and found myself thinking of something my grandmother used to say, something that had never made complete sense to me, until I watched Ingrid crouch beside that injured creature without a second thought. Humans have a long history of helping things that cannot help themselves, even when it costs us something to do it, I said. It is not always logical. I will not pretend it always is. But somewhere in our history, helping something weaker, or something in pain, became tied up with our own sense of who we are, almost separate from whether that help made survival sense in the moment. Ingrid did not stop, because she calculated that freeing that creature would benefit her trial performance. She stopped because it was suffering, and she was capable of stopping the suffering, and to her, in that instant, that was reason enough. Even at risk to herself, Thal said quietly. Even at risk to herself, I confirmed. It's not unique to her. It's not unique to any one person in that chamber. It runs through most of us, to different degrees. We built entire professions around it. Rescue workers, emergency doctors, people who spend their lives running toward disasters that everyone else is running away from, not because it is safe, but because someone needs to. and they have decided that someone might as well be them. Ambassador Crix's many eyes narrowed slightly, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness. This is difficult for me to reconcile with your species' historical record. Our files are full of conflict, war, violence between your own people, spanning centuries. How does a species capable of that kind of harm also produce the behavior we witness today? It was a fair question, and not one I could answer with any simple comfort. Because we are not a simple species, I said. I won't stand here and tell you, humanity's history is only made of moments, like the ones you watch today. It isn't. We have done terrible things to each other, and to our own world. That history is real, and I would never ask you to look away from it. But the same conditions that produced our worst moments also produced our best ones. A species that had to fight so hard just to survive learned two very different lessons from that fight. Some of us learned to fear each other, to see other people as competition for limited resources, and that fear built the worst chapters of our history. But some of us learned the opposite lesson. We learned that we survive better together than apart, that a group willing to look out for each other has a far better chance of making it through the next disaster than a group that turns inward on itself. Both of those instincts live inside us at the same time. Today, in that chamber, you watched the second instinct win. Thal was quiet for a long moment, studying the display screen where the trial summary still glowed. The third section begins in 10 minutes, he said finally. You understand what it is designed to measure. The unwinnable scenario, I said. Yes, every species who has reached this stage of the trial has ultimately failed it, some catastrophically. It is designed specifically to remove the possibility of victory entirely, to see what a species becomes when hope is no longer a valid strategy. We have watched species collapse into despair. We have watched species turn on each other, blame each other, abandon each other, once they understood there was no way to win. He paused. Given what we have witnessed today, I confess I do not know what to expect. Neither do I admitted. But I don't think losing is the same thing to us as it is to most of the species you've tested before. Crix tilted his head slightly, a gesture I had learned usually indicated genuine confusion, rather than distress. Explain. I thought of every disaster my own people had lived through and rebuilt from. Every story I had grown up hearing about communities that came together not despite catastrophe but because of it. Every account I had read of people who had lost everything, and still found a way to help the person standing next to them who had lost just as much. For most species, I said slowly, I imagine losing feels like an ending, a final verdict on whether the effort mattered at all. But humans have lost so many things, so many times, across our entire history, that we stopped treating loss as an ending a long time ago. We treat it as a condition we have to keep surviving, together, for as long as it takes. I don't think the 5 people in that chamber are about to walk into an unwinnable scenario and try to win it. I think they're about to walk in and prove that losing never stopped being something we could survive, as long as we don't have to survive it alone. The room fell silent, and I watched something shift across the faces of the evaluators around me, something that looked, for the first time since I had entered that briefing room, less like fear of the unknown, and more like the quiet, uncertain beginning of understanding. The intercom crackled softly overhead, announcing that the third and final section of the trial was about to begin. Thal rose from where he had been leaning against the table, straightening his posture as though preparing himself for something he could no longer predict the outcome of. Then let us go and watch, he said. We returned to the observation deck together, and I took my place at the glass, just as the chamber's environment began to shift once more. The calm, resetting light giving way to something heavier, darker, and far more final than anything the 5 volunteers had faced so far. Somewhere inside that shifting light, Owen, Priya, Diego, Ingrid, and Malik were about to step into the one section of the trial that had never once, in 300 years, allowed a single species to walk away with anything that could honestly be called a victory. I found myself gripping the edge of the railing in front of the glass, my earlier confidence tangled now with a knot of genuine worry, because for all the certainty I had tried to project in that briefing room, I honestly did not know what I was about to watch. The chamber's environment rendered itself into something that looked, at first glance, almost peaceful. A wide, open plain, stretched out beneath a sky the color of dying embers. and in the distance, a cluster of structures stood against the horizon, simple buildings that resembled a small settlement. It did not look like danger. It looked like the quiet moments right before disaster, and I understood immediately why that stillness was the point. The narrating voice of the simulation spoke, calm and detached, laying out the scenario with the same clinical tone it had used in every previous section. A catastrophic seismic event had been detected. The settlement ahead housed 40 simulated inhabitants. The structural collapse was already in progress and could not be stopped. The volunteers had exactly 11 minutes before the entire settlement would be lost. Given the terrain, the distance, and the number of people requiring evacuation, it was mathematically impossible to save everyone. The simulation's own internal calculations, displayed briefly on the corner of the screen for the observation deck to see, indicated that even under perfect conditions, no more than 18 of the 40 inhabitants could realistically be evacuated in the time available. This was the unwinnable scenario. I had read enough about its history to know that its cruelty was not in the danger itself, but in the certainty of failure built directly into its foundation. It did not ask a species to overcome an obstacle. It told them, explicitly and mathematically, that more than half of the people they were about to try to save were already lost before they had taken a single step, and then it asked them to act anyway, to watch that failure happen in real time while trying to salvage whatever could still be salvaged. Every species who had faced this scenario before had understood, on some level, exactly what the trial was measuring, not whether they could win, because winning had already been made impossible. It measured what happened to a species' character once hope stopped being useful. I thought of the records I had read. A proud, disciplined species called the Kethrani had entered this scenario nearly 100 years ago, 4 representatives working with military precision, and had managed to save exactly 18 inhabitants, matching the simulation's calculated maximum. On paper, that should have counted as a form of success. But the trial had still marked it as a failure, because in the final minutes, as the settlement collapsed around them, 2 of the 4 Kethrani representatives had turned on the others, blaming them for wasted time, for choosing the wrong evacuation route, for decisions that could not have been known to be wrong until after the fact. The scenario had ended with the Kethrani team fractured, shouting at each other over the wreckage of a settlement they had done everything reasonably possible to save. A smaller, gentler species had entered the scenario decades before that, and collapsed entirely under the weight of the math itself. Faced with the certainty that more than half the simulated people could not be saved no matter what they did, they had simply stopped moving, overwhelmed by grief before the countdown had even reached its halfway point, and the settlement had been lost entirely, all 40 inhabitants gone, because despair had taken hold before action ever had the chance to matter. I watched the timer appear on the display, 11 minutes counting down in sharp red numbers, and I watched Owen turn to the others without a single second of hesitation. 18 is the ceiling, he said, his voice steady, despite the impossible weight of what he had just said out loud. We're not accepting that number. We move fast, and we adjust as we go. Priya, you and Malik take the east side of the settlement. Get anyone who can walk moving toward the evacuation point immediately. Diego, with me. We're going for the ones who can't move on their own. Ingrid, find us a faster route than the one the simulation is suggesting. There has to be one. Ingrid was already studying the terrain, her earlier scientific curiosity now sharpened into something more urgent. The eastern ridge, she said after only a few seconds. It cuts nearly 400 meters off the direct path, if we're willing to risk the loose rock. We're willing, Owen said, and the group split immediately, moving with the same fast, coordinated rhythm I had watched them build across the last 2 sections. Except now, every movement carried the added weight of knowing, with mathematical certainty, that some of what they were racing to reach would not make it in time, no matter what they did. I watched Priya and Malik reach the eastern edge of the settlement first, moving through structures that groaned and cracked around them, pulling simulated inhabitants from doorways, guiding them toward the evacuation point with quick, clear instructions. Priya's medical training showed in every triage decision she made in real time, prioritizing those who could move fastest first, buying precious seconds for the ones who would need more help later. Diego and Owen reached the settlement's center, where the structural damage was worst, and I watched them work through the wreckage with a kind of controlled urgency that never once tipped into panic. They found an elderly simulated figure trapped beneath a partially collapsed wall, and rather than abandoning the attempt when the extraction proved difficult, Diego wedged a length of broken support beam beneath the wall, while Owen pulled the figure free, the two of them moving with a coordination that needed no spoken instruction at this point in the trial. The timer continued its relentless countdown. 7 minutes. 6 minutes. I watched the number of evacuated simulated inhabitants climb on the display's tracking counter. 5, then 9, then 12, each rescue costing precious seconds that could never be recovered. At the 4-minute mark, something happened that I had not seen coming, and judging by the sharp intake of breath from Director Thal beside me, neither had he. A structural support beam near the settlement's central well gave way entirely, trapping 3 simulated inhabitants beneath a section of collapsed roofing that had not been part of the scenario's original danger zones. It was an escalation, the kind the trial's algorithms were designed to introduce specifically to test how a team responded when the situation grew worse than initially calculated. Owen and Diego were already moving toward the new collapse when Ingrid's voice cut through the audio pickup. The ridge route is failing. Loose rock is coming down faster than projected. I need another 2 minutes to find an alternate path, or the group coming from the east side won't make it to the evacuation point in time. For a moment, the math became impossible in an entirely new way. There were now more people needing help than there were hands available to help them, and less time than there had been even a minute earlier. I braced myself, watching the screen, waiting for the moment the Kathrani had reached, the moment blame started, the moment the group's cohesion cracked under the weight of an impossible decision, with no good answer left inside it. It did not come. "Diego, take the new collapse," Owen said. "I'm going to help Ingrid stabilize the ridge path myself." He turned and sprinted toward Ingrid's position, without a shred of hesitation, and I watched Diego, alone now at the central collapse site, begin working through the wreckage with a speed that suggested he understood exactly how little time remained, and had simply decided to move faster, rather than to feel the fear that time was creating. Priya's voice came through next, tight with strain but steady. "East group is at 14. We have 6 more inside the last structure. It's unstable. I need 30 more seconds." "Take it," Owen called back, even as he and Ingrid worked frantically to shore up a section of the ridge path with anything they could find. Rope, loose stone, the sheer force of their own bodies bracing against the crumbling ground. The final 90 seconds of the scenario unfolded in a blur that I would only fully understand later, watching the replay footage frame by frame. Diego managed to free 2 of the 3 inhabitants trapped beneath the new collapse, before the timer forced the section to lock. The third figure lost when the wreckage shifted too far to safely extract in time. Priya and Malik guided their final group across the ridge path just as it began to genuinely fail beneath their feet. Ingrid and Owen's makeshift stabilization holding just long enough for the last of them to clear it before the entire section collapsed into rubble behind them. The timer reached 0. The status line appeared on the display screen, and the observation deck went completely silent as everyone read it together. 26 inhabitants evacuated, 14 lost. Scenario ceiling exceeded by 8. They had not won. 14 simulated lives had still been lost, a number that would have been treated, by any prior species standards, as a devastating and permanent failure. But they had exceeded the trial's own calculated maximum by 8, a number that should not have been mathematically possible, given the constraints the scenario had built in from the very beginning. I expected, based on everything I had read about how this section historically ended, to see grief tip over into blame, to watch the 5 volunteers turn on each other over the 14 they could not save, to watch the mathematically guaranteed failure finally crack something inside the group's cohesion, the way it had cracked every group who had faced it before them. Instead, I watched Diego sit down heavily on a fallen section of rubble, his shoulders dropping, his breathing ragged. Priya moved to him immediately, not to check for physical injury this time, but simply to sit beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in quiet support. Malik crouched down in front of both of them, saying something too quiet for the audio pickup to catch clearly, though I could see Diego nod slowly in response. Owen and Ingrid made their way back from the ridge path, both of them clearly exhausted, and Owen's first action upon reaching the group was not to assess the trial's outcome or calculate what they might have done differently. He simply crouched down next to Diego and said, loud enough for the pickup to catch this time, You got 2 of the 3. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. We lost 14 people, Diego said quietly. We did, Owen agreed, no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to soften the truth of it. And 26 of them are alive, because none of us stopped moving, even when the math said we should. Both of those things are true at the same time. We carry both. I felt something tighten in my throat, watching that exchange, watching 5 exhausted people sit together in the wreckage of a scenario built specifically to break them, choosing, in that moment, to hold their grief and their effort side by side, rather than letting one erase the other. The simulation's status line updated one final time, and I watched Director Thal read it silently, before turning to look at me, his expression unlike anything I had seen from him across the entire trial. Trial complete. Section 3. Evaluation. Group cohesion under confirmed failure conditions. Stable. No fracturing detected. No blame assignment detected. Continued cooperative action maintained through scenario conclusion. They knew they could not save everyone, Thal said quietly, almost to himself. They knew it from the very first moment the scenario began, and they kept working anyway, and when it ended, they did not turn on each other over what they could not change. No, I said, they wouldn't. Losing together isn't the same as losing alone. Not to them. I don't think it ever occurred to any of them to blame each other for math that was broken before they ever stepped into that chamber. The chamber doors slid open, and the 5 volunteers made their way out slowly, exhaustion clear in every movement. But something else was there too, something steady beneath the fatigue. Owen had an arm slung loosely around Diego's shoulders. Priya was walking close beside Malik, their conversation low and easy despite everything they had just been through. Ingrid brought up the rear, glancing back once at the now empty chamber, before turning to catch up with the others. They were not smiling the way they had before entering, not with the easy humor from the holding bay hours earlier. This was something quieter, more worn, but unmistakably present, the particular expression of people who had walked through something terrible together and had come out the other side still intact, still connected, still willing to look at each other honestly about what had been lost and what had been saved. The observation deck remained silent for a long moment after the chamber doors closed behind them. I looked around at the delegates from 11 different worlds, watching expressions I had learned, over the last several hours, to read with growing accuracy. Confusion, disbelief, and in more than a few, something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of respect they had not expected to feel. Ambassador Crix was the first to speak, his reedy voice quieter than I had heard it all day. In 300 years, he said slowly, no species has completed this trial without at least one critical failure across the 3 sections. Explain to me, Officer Voss, how a species capable of the history in your files, a history full of conflict and harm, produced this outcome today. I thought about everything I had told the evaluators in that briefing room, about fear and humor, and the 2 very different lessons a hard world could teach the same species, and I found that I did not have a longer, more complicated answer than the one that had been sitting at the center of it all along. I don't think they passed today because they were the strongest species you've ever tested, I said. I've seen the files on some of the others. Plenty of you were stronger, faster, better built for hostile terrain than we are. I don't think they passed because they were the smartest either, though I'll admit watching Ingrid solve half these problems in real time was something to see. I think they passed because losing never stopped being something my people could survive, as long as they didn't have to survive it alone. Every disaster we've ever lived through as a species taught us that lesson over and over, until it became something we didn't even have to think about anymore. It just became who we are. Thal was quiet for a long moment, watching the empty chamber through the glass. The assembly will need weeks to properly review today's results, he said finally. Our models will need to be rebuilt. Our understanding of what resilience looks like across different species will need to be reconsidered entirely. That sounds like a lot of work, I said. It is, he agreed, and for the first time since I had met him, something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his features, but I suspect it will be worth it. Down in the corridor beyond the chamber, I could just make out the 5 volunteers through a secondary viewport, moving slowly toward the medical bay for standard post-trial evaluation, still close together, still talking quietly among themselves. Owen said something that made Malik laugh, a tired, genuine sound, and Priya shook her head with the fond exasperation of someone who had heard one too many of his jokes over the last several hours. They had not passed the trial by proving they could win. They had passed it by proving that even when winning was never on the table, they would not let the loss break what mattered most, the simple, stubborn refusal to let each other face the worst of it alone. I stood at the glass, long after the observation deck had begun to empty, watching the last traces of the trial's simulated wreckage fade from the display screens, and I found myself thinking that perhaps the assembly had been asking the wrong question about Deathworlders all along. They had spent 300 years wondering whether a species built by hardship would be too dangerous, too unpredictable, too shaped by violence, to be trusted with a seat at their table. Nobody had ever thought to ask what that same hardship might have taught us about holding on to each other when everything else fell apart. Somewhere behind me, I heard Director Thal murmur something to another evaluator, his voice carrying just far enough for me to catch the words, before I finally turned and walked away from the glass. Every species we have tested has been broken by that final scenario in some way. Today, for the first time in 3 centuries, we finally understood why that had never once been true for them.